So in a previous presentation, we had discussed the matter of the spiritual world, how quantum physics was pointing towards something beyond what we can directly see and experience, and how matter itself is influenced by non-material things, such as our minds. So in that we saw that we are beings which are more than just matter. So to what extent do we understand mind? Well, if you really look at the literature, no matter all the blather about, evolutionary development of the brain, in the end, there is no real scientific explanation for the mind. We don't understand how it arises. Many very famous scientists who do study the mind have said as much. Now, does the fact that we don't understand where the mind comes from, how it works, should that stop us from believing in or using our minds? No, of course not. Right? Just as we don't understand or cannot really explain quantum physics, cannot visualize it really in a lot of its facets, it doesn't stop us from using it. We can use the predictions and calculations of the theory very successfully. So to someone who says, I only live by what I can explain and understand and see and feel and touch, that's totally out of touch with the real world as we know it today. That is someone who doesn't understand the scientific advances of the last few decades and what it has done to how we should see the world. Okay, so just because we don't understand it or cannot explain it, that's not necessarily a good reason for rejecting it. We've seen that we are beings which are more than matter. So let's think about what happens if we try to violate physical laws. Of course, Wile E. Coyote does it all the time, challenging these physical laws, especially gravity. And perhaps he doesn't try it intentionally. But if you do, the laws will win. That's just the way physical law works. If you try to outsmart physical laws, you will probably be in trouble. Now, just as there are physical laws, are there emotional laws? Right? What happens when those laws are violated? For example, if you cause someone emotional pain, we know the results, we may know the causes, psychological injury, a psychological burden someone has to bear if they're abused or traumatized, and there are consequences on both sides. So there are something like emotional laws. And it's hard to get away from. Even if you are a nice, you are a forgiving type of person, someone wrongs you, you still feel the burden, the injury, the emotional and psychological injury. And what happens if the damage is not repaired? There are consequences which may follow you around, for most of your life, depending on the extent of the emotional, psychological injury. What kind of beings are we? So, if we are indeed spiritual beings, what happens if we refuse to honor that spiritual nature? What if we go through our lives pretending that we are not spiritual beings? If a fish decides to go against its nature and try to breathe on land, that's not going to work out too well. So we can refuse to honor our nature, or certain parts of our nature, but that will land us in trouble. Now, what if our choices are going to determine what we are going to become in the eternal state? If we are spiritual beings that are meant to exist forever, what if our choices determine what that forever is like? And what if there are spiritual laws that determine this, just as physical laws and emotional laws and psychological laws? What if our choices are molding us and shaping us for something eternal? The material in this presentation is from a Sunday school class I gave based on The Reason for God by Timothy Keller, and he has a chapter on hell. And you might ask, why tackle this topic? It's a very thorny topic. It's a very difficult topic to deal with. Well, it's interesting. You may know Penn Jillette of Penn and Teller, the magician duo. And he said something very interesting. He said, "I've always said that I don't respect people who don't proselytize. I don't respect that at all. If you believe that there's a heaven and a hell, and people could be going to hell or not getting eternal life, and you think that it's not really worth telling them this because it would make it socially awkward, and atheists who think people shouldn't proselytize and who say just leave me alone and keep your religion to yourself, how much do you have to hate somebody to not proselytize? How much do you have to hate somebody to believe everlasting life is possible and not tell them that?" Interesting. He goes on to say, "I mean, if I believed beyond the shadow of a doubt that a truck was coming at you, and you didn't believe that truck was bearing down on you, there's a certain point where I'd tackle you. And this is more important than that." So, yeah, we should think about and talk about hell and see how it fits in with reality, if indeed we are spiritual beings. So let's start with a working definition of hell, which most people would agree with: a place of eternal conscious punishment for the wicked. Just as an aside, if you're interested, there's the question of, did Jesus descend into hell, which you might see in certain versions of the Apostles' Creed. And very briefly, this is a misunderstanding of the word Hades. Until AD 650, no version of the Creed included this phrase with the intention of saying that Christ descended into hell. The only reason to include the phrase before that time simply means buried. So if you want to look into that further, but Jesus did not descend into hell. At least not that the scriptures tell us. Right? So how do people react to the idea of hell? A Bible commentator, actually, Gordon Wenham, he says, "Whatever anyone says, unending torment speaks to me of sadism, not justice." Interesting. And Keller, he quotes, "In our culture, divine judgment is one of Christianity's most offensive doctrines." Well, why is that the case? And he suggests it is because the Western and modern desire to control and shape reality to our wishes and to determine right and wrong for ourselves, the idea of hell rubs us the wrong way. So what is hell? We had our working definition. Someone said hell is a measure of a theologian's faithfulness to Scripture. Okay. So Scripture is pretty clear about hell and being a good idea to avoid it. And a lot of theologians are not happy with that concept. The word Gehenna in the Old Testament times denoted a place of child sacrifice. Right? And for example, in Jeremiah 7:31, and is a place that was generally thought to be an accursed place because of that horrible practice that was done by the pagans surrounding Israel. It was a garbage and a sewage dump in the time of Christ. And again, that concept of, someplace, uncleanness, garbage and trash, and burning, that picture of Gehenna, a place of burning. Hades usually means the grave or the tomb where we're buried. It's where the dead go, someplace dead go. Not necessarily hell, just being dead and buried. And we can see this word used in Luke 10:15 and in the book of Revelations. Another word, Tartaros, is only one verse where that's found, in 2 Peter 2:4. It's a place of eternal torment for the sinful angels. Here's some other texts on hell. Revelations 14, 9-11, and especially see verse 11. And another angel, a third, followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and its image, and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, these worshippers of the beast and its image, and whoever receives the mark of its name. Especially see verse 11 where it says the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. Mark 9, 43-48, especially verse 47. And if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than with 2 hands to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than with 2 feet to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into hell, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Now, of course, people in Jesus' time and beyond knew that he was speaking figuratively, of course, and with exaggeration, and no one actually carried any of these out on themselves, except for one theologian, and we'll not go into that. Unquenchable fire, where the worm does not die. What do these imply? We'll come back to that. In the book of Revelation, we see, and I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, according to what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them according to what they had done. So here we see a hint of what is discussed in Luke and Matthew. Luke 12, 47, 48, Matthew 11, 22, 24, Luke 20, 47, is that there seem to be degrees of punishment and reward according to their works. So no one receives exactly the same punishment or reward. Important thing to keep in mind as we go forward. And here in Luke 20:47, and that servant who knew his master's will but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required, and from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more. So there's degrees of punishment and reward. And again, all this talk of beating, it sounds uncomfortable to Westerners, modern Westerners, but not to most of the world. Who will be judged? And I've just given some passages here. You can look them up. Unbelievers will be judged, Revelations 20:12, Romans 2:5-7. Believers will be judged, Romans 14:10-12, 2 Corinthians 5:10, Romans 2:6-11, Revelations 20:12-15, and many more. Angels will be judged, 1 Corinthians 6, verse 3. What will be judged? Every word, thought, and deed. And you can look up these passages, Matthew 12:36, Ecclesiastes 12:14, Romans 2:16, Luke 8:17, Luke 12:2-3, 1 Corinthians 4, verse 5. Who will do the judging? We see a lot of passages here, like 2 Timothy 4:1, Acts 10:42, which say Jesus Christ, who is to judge the living and the dead. In Acts 10:42, Jesus Christ, the one ordained by God to be the judge of the living and the dead. What is the result of this judgment? Again, we saw that it's judgment according to our works and the degrees of reward and punishment, and that believers need not fear death or condemnation because of the saving work of Christ on the cross. So why do we have this judgment? What's the point of it all? Well, one reason would be that it displays and fulfills God's holiness, righteousness, grace, and mercy. God's holiness will be satisfied, his righteousness will be satisfied, but also we will see his grace. We will see his love, we will see his mercy at work. Romans 3:19 is an interesting phrase, is every mouth will be stopped. And this refers to a court case where the defendant, he has nothing else he can say in response to the charges brought against him. Everyone will see that God's judgments are completely just, perfect, justified. His holiness, his righteousness will be completely justified for everyone. Revelation 19, verse 1-2 says, Hallelujah, salvation and glory and power belong to our God, for his judgments are true and just. So the saints will be praising God because everyone will be able to see God's judgments are perfect. So, is our distaste of hell, is it just a cultural objection? The thought that God shouldn't judge me for the way I live my life, it's my choice, is this a universal sentiment or is it cultural? And Keller writes, in traditional societies, the teaching about turning the other cheek makes absolutely no sense. Right? It offends their instincts about what is right. For them, the doctrine of a God of judgment, however, is no problem at all. It seems to be secular Westerners who get the most upset about this idea of being judged. But for most of the world, it makes sense, right? So it seems to be just a cultural thing. And if it is cultural, why should Western secular culture be the final judge about this concept of hell? If it's just cultural, why should the rest of the world agree? And Keller goes on to discuss ancient versus modern outlooks on the universe, really, on reality, on life. And he says, in ancient times, it was understood there was a transcendent moral order outside the self, built into the fabric of the universe. If you violated that metaphysical order, there were consequences. And so, for people in ancient times, being wise, the path of wisdom, was to learn to live in conformity with this unyielding reality. And so it's what we talked about earlier about there being spiritual laws just as real as physical laws. Now, in another book, Jonathan Sacks, he wrote a book called Covenant and Conversation. It's a Jewish perspective on reading the book of Leviticus. And in this discussion about the law of the red heifer, I believe, is where he talks about this word, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, hok, usually translated as statute or decree. In actual fact, hok is a word that brings together two concepts of law. There are scientific laws which explain the isness of the world, how the world is, and there are moral laws which prescribe the oughtness of the world, how things ought to be. The singular meaning of hok is that it brings both concepts together. They are laws we ought to keep because they honor the structure of reality. So again, if the spiritual world is real, there are probably spiritual laws, and if we choose to violate them or obey them, there will be certain consequences. So Keller goes on to talk about the modern impulse, where modern man reversed this, and ultimate reality was seen not as supernatural order, but malleable. So Keller writes, instead of trying to shape our desires to fit reality, we now seek to control and shape reality to fit our desires. That's a recipe for disaster if this is not the way the world works. So another book by Michael Julian, he is a physicist, His book is called Believing is Seeing. A physicist explains how science shattered his atheism and revealed the necessity of faith. And he said at what point he studied all the major religions of the world when he was seeking truth. And he said, according to these very logical religions, we always get what we deserve. Karma rules the cosmos and wins the day. You mess up, the universe punishes you. You hurt me, I hurt you. It's always an eye for an eye. Also, if you want to get into heaven or nirvana or paradise, you got to earn it. There's no free lunch. The logic is very worldly, very simple-minded, very predictable. Right? When he talks about simple-minded, he means in the sense of he compares it to another type of higher logic, which we won't discuss here. But he's talking about what he calls trivial types of truths. It doesn't mean it's not consequential, but they are simple and logical, simply logical. All right. Maybe I'll talk about that in a different video. A loving God wouldn't send people to hell just for not believing the right thing, would he? Well, has anybody really said that God's judgment is like an exam where you answer questions about what you believe? Is belief itself what sends you to heaven or hell? Well, it depends what you mean. In the ancient world, and especially in Jewish thought, beliefs were to lead to behavior. And for example, if you look in the book of James, it says, "You show me your works, and I'll show you what you believe." Right? So they're not just intellectual beliefs, but it's a matter of what your beliefs, your true beliefs, are revealed in your life, in your behavior. So intellectually agreeing that Christ is the Son of God who died for his sins, you need more than that. You need it to affect your life. And we can see, for example, where Hitler's beliefs in evolution, in Darwinism, and that his higher race was to subjugate lower races, that's where beliefs, right? You can see very clearly how beliefs lead to behavior. Also, Hitler's hostility against the church, how he planned to destroy the church, how Christianity was a religion that protected the poor and the weak, and so he hated Christianity for it, and that's how his beliefs led to a world war. What is the biblical picture of sin and judgment? So let's go back to the basics of what it really looks like. It's not just a matter of filling out on a form what your correct beliefs are. Right? If we go back to the beginning, looking at the book of Genesis, we see that we were created for God. And what do we mean by that? God is the source, the final and ultimate source of all that is good. For example, wisdom, joy, love. If God is the ultimate source of that, how can we best flourish and achieve our highest potential? The best thing we can do is to be close to the source of all that is good, which is God. Now, what about sin? How does sin affect this relationship with God? What are the results? Well, if God is the source of wisdom and joy and love and all that is good, the further we get away from him, what happens to us? Right? It's not good. The results are not good. How does the image of fire that we see when hell is described, how does it describe the effects of sin? Well, we think about it, fire disintegrates, fire burns out, fire consumes. And Keller writes, even in this life we can see the kind of soul disintegration that self-centeredness creates. Right? So it ends up with all kinds of unpleasantness, bitterness, envy, anxiety, paranoia, and so forth. But this word sin, it sounds so archaic. How serious a problem is sin really? Well, we only need to look at the cross to think about how serious sin is, if we think about Christ's sufferings, and I'll put a link to some helpful videos or sites that talk about, that discuss, that examine Christ's sufferings from a medical perspective. But in summary, we can remember that, for example, his body was ripped to shreds, his back and probably around his back, ripped by the Roman flagrum, right, which was had something which had kind of little dumbbell-shaped pieces of lead and several straps. When he was at the cross, when he was nailed to the cross, the nerves in his wrist were crushed by nails. Think about the pain. The crown of thorns was jammed on his head. The movie The Passion of the Christ, it's hard to watch. It's really not for the faint of heart, but I think it does show really what Christ did go through, his sufferings. So that's how serious sin is. So serious that Christ himself, God in the flesh, had to undergo that suffering to save us from the consequences of sin. Who is God? So if we think about again, who is God, what would it mean to be totally out of the presence of God, to lose his presence? We would lose the ultimate source of wisdom and of joy and of love. What kind of an existence is that? So the matter of sin and hell, it's not just a matter of intellectual agreements about certain beliefs. It's something more than that. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit. So here's another objection. Eternal punishment is unfair. Okay. There's certainly something, I think, which a lot of people would say, hey, you know, that our sin, you know, maybe 70 years of life, 80 years, 90 years, the sin we did during this lifetime, you know, how could it equate to eternal punishment? But is sin and hell just an accounting problem? Is it just a matter of the right numbers? Or is it something much, much deeper? Is it the necessary outworking of moral laws and spiritual laws? What does this mean? So let's think about, is it unfair that people die due to physical laws? One moment stepping off a building, for example, a couple of seconds of action, of choice, is it unfair that you die because of that? In the same way, is it unfair whatever the outworking of moral and spiritual laws actually is? Or is it more a question of what do we ultimately become versus what we owe in an accounting sense? Are our choices pushing us, molding us, shaping us towards something desirable or not? What is this punishment going to be like? The Bible uses a lot of imagery to try to describe this punishment, but what is it really going to be like? C.S. Lewis wrote this really interesting little book called The Great Divorce. It doesn't sound very interesting, but in the book he imagines what would it be like if there was a bus going from hell to heaven, and anyone in hell could choose to get on the bus and visit heaven. And in the book, we find that people from hell are just so intent on entering heaven on their own terms, shaping heaven to be what they want, that they cannot accept it as it is, a place of a perfect love, a place of perfect joy, a place where God is supreme and actually, is enjoyed by inhabitants of heaven. And so, due to their insistence on things being the way they want it to be, they are unable to accept staying in heaven. They are just caught up in their own little worlds, which ultimately are their hells. So interesting. Now, are there similar things today? We can see, for example, in the demand for safe spaces. Maybe hell is the ultimate form of a safe space. It's an eternal safe space away from God and away from others. So some parallels today. We also don't understand the nature of eternity, how that's going to be like, especially in terms of hell. So we would think of eternity as something just goes on forever, and yes, that there is that aspect, but we really don't know how that's going to play out. And Lewis's book is a very interesting look at what it may be like. People who are bound up in their own misery and dissatisfaction and bitterness, gradually pushing themselves away from everyone else. Is that what hell is like? Well, it's not hard to think that might be the case. Now, Revelation 22:11 has a very interesting thought. Let the evildoer still do evil, and the filthy still be filthy. So maybe hell is eternal because the inhabitants of hell are sinning eternally. That they're consciously and eternally shutting their eyes tight and clenching their fists against the love and goodness and justice of God. So perhaps that's why they remain in hell. Another way it's been described is the flames of God's love. God's love is so pure that they can't stand it. They can't stand to be in that presence because it's not their definition of love. It's not their concept of love. It doesn't fit what they want. God's love is a sacrificial love, a self-giving love, a love centered on others, is a love that rejoices in justice and righteousness and holiness. Again, the various language used to describe hell are the metaphors for waste, for ruin, for destruction, for corruption. Destruction not in the sense that the soul is destroyed, but in the sense of an ongoing corruption. So Romans 1:24 says God gave them up to their desires. Is this what hell is? Is the final state in hell God saying, all right, this is what you've asked for, and this is what you get. The people on the bus from hell in Lewis's parable would rather have their freedom, so-called freedom, as they define it, than salvation. I think it was Lewis who wrote, there are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say, thy will be done to God, or those to whom God in the end says, thy will be done. All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, it wouldn't be hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Now, we're talking about joy, the type of joy that comes from God. Another way he puts it is, hell is the greatest monument to human freedom. That without hell, our choices that we make in this life are ultimately meaningless. It is hell that gives these choices dignity and meaning and seriousness. So the thought here is that in each of us there is something growing which will be hell unless it is nipped in the bud. Keller puts it this way. The people in hell are miserable, but Lewis shows us why. We see raging like unchecked flames, their pride, their paranoia, their self-pity, their certainty that everyone else is wrong, that everyone else is an idiot. All their humility is gone, and thus so is their sanity. So let's update our working definition of hell, a place of eternal conscious punishment for the wicked. With this definition, a state of definitive self-exclusion from communion with God and the blessed. And that's found in the Catechism. Or as Keller puts it, hell, then, is the trajectory of a soul living a self-absorbed, self-centered life, going on and on forever. So let's look at some non-biblical ideas of hell. Hey, maybe these work better. Maybe not. Well, there's the very popular idea of annihilationism. And to my surprise, John Stott adopts that view. So does Clark Pinnock, the Church of England, and Jehovah's Witnesses. So that instead of hell, you are destroyed. There's another nuance of it. It's also called conditional immortality. Only the redeemed will be raised to immortality. Right? Those who are unrighteous, unredeemed, will be eventually destroyed. So Seventh-day Adventists believe the wicked will be punished in the lake of fire before ultimately being destroyed. So this sounds preferable to eternal punishment, right? But there's a problem. Well, let's look at that later. Universalism is another idea that in the end, ultimately, everyone will be saved. Sounds more loving, doesn't it? Sounds more comfortable. So what is the problem with these ideas? So here's one claim, that the prospect of annihilation still engenders fear. So that should still work, right? If hell is not eternal, annihilation still works because it's still something that people should be afraid of. But does it really? I mean, isn't it easy to imagine someone who believes in annihilation but takes the deal and says, okay, I'm just going to cease to exist, but in the meantime, I'll just do all the evil that I can, inflict all the suffering and torture and misery on my fellow human beings that I want. And in the end, poof, I don't exist, so I don't care. So universalism has the same problem. So universalism says in the end, everyone will be saved. Oh, well, if that's the case, how about in this life, I be as evil as I want? And I mean, eventually I'll be saved, right? I'm not sure how that works. Maybe it's reincarnation. Maybe it's, spending time in some horrible boarding school in the afterlife. Who knows? I don't care. Maybe I'll be evil for 99% of my lifetimes or whatever. I'll take that deal, right? There are people who will take that deal. So does it really have that same effect? No, it doesn't. Ultimately, if you're willing to pay the price, ultimately what's the consequences? Ultimately, there's no consequence. If you're willing to spend 1,000 years in some kind of hell or some kind of suffering for whatever evil you choose to inflict, and in the end you get out, you've gamed the system, right? So as long as you're willing to pay the price, annihilationism and universalism, in the end, it makes a mockery of justice. Here's another problem. If the wicked are punished in the lake of fire first, why will they be destroyed? I mean, if they're punished first, haven't they paid the price for their sins? Why destroy them? And it also implies something else, that we can pay the price of our own sins right, in full. And if that's the case, why did Christ have to come and die and suffer and die that horrible death? It sounds enlightened and more fluffy and more kind and more loving at first, but in the end, these ideas don't really work in the sense that if you're willing to game the system, you can cheat justice, right? You can make a mockery of justice. So here's another objection. Well, I believe in a God of love. A God of love would never send anyone to hell. Well, let's ask ourselves first, where does this belief come from, that God is a God of love? This concept comes from one place and one place alone, the Bible. Because looking around you at mankind, you could never come to this conclusion, right? Looking at the evil that we do, looking at the suffering, we could never come to this crazy idea that God is a God of love. And no other religion teaches this. So if you believe in a God of love, you believe in the Bible. And maybe you should believe everything it says instead of just part of it. A question that Keller raises is, are loving persons never filled with wrath? Of course they are. If you see someone ruining themselves or someone ruining someone you love, of course you can be filled with wrath, with anger, right? As it puts it, anger isn't the opposite of love. Hate is. And the final form of hate is indifference. So love in and of itself does not exclude feeling anger. Here's another objection. If you believe in a God of wrath, you might feel justified in doing some smiting yourself. So, okay, if your God is wrathful, and maybe you'll do the same. But let's ask ourselves, would it be okay if God were not angry at sin and injustice? Would that be okay? Of course not. Right? If God were not angry at sin and injustice, what kind of God is that? And actually, believing in God's vengeance gives us the power to refrain from revenge. It is a lack of belief in this that secretly nourishes violence. Right? If we don't believe in God will dispense justice or vengeance, then we will have to do it ourselves. And this is what nourishes violence. Not believing in the final judgment, not believing in the consequences for sin. We have to become our own agents of vengeance. So, a true opium of the people is a belief in nothingness after death. The huge solace of thinking that our betrayals, greed, cowardice, murders are not going to be judged. And we've seen this in the horrors of a communist government. Holocausts which left over 100 million dead in the modern era, the modern secular scientific era. All fueled by the certainty in their minds that there would be no consequences. God of love and judgment. So again, why do people believe God is love? Again, the Bible is the only source for that belief. And also for the belief that we can know God intimately and personally. And that same Bible tells us of God's judgment and the consequences of sin. And Jesus spoke more about hell than any other prophet. In the final analysis, how does knowing God help us accept the existence of hell? Knowing and trusting in God, in His character, which is holiness and justice and love. So, knowing that God is perfectly just and loving, and His judgments will also be seen by everyone to be perfectly just and loving. If we have a concept of hell that seems to be wrong, seems to be unjust, then probably there's something we're not getting. Our concept is flawed. So, for example, if we have a concept that someone who steals a loaf of bread, is going to be flogged, for eternity, something's wrong with how we understand justice and judgment. Something's wrong with that concept. We can be assured, all right, that it will not be unjust because God is perfectly just and also perfectly loving. And how can we be assured of this? Again, it is the cross. That to allow perfect justice and perfect love side by side, God himself endured the horrible suffering of the cross. And because of that, we know we can be assured that we can trust in his character. How should this all affect us? In light of the coming judgment, aim to please God, of course. Okay. As in 2 Corinthians 5 and 2 Corinthians 3. Stir up one another to love and good works, as in Hebrews 10:24-25. Be assured that the wrongdoer will be paid back, in Colossians 3:25. So that should satisfy our need for justice, and it also enables us to forgive freely. Because we want everyone to come to the grace and love and salvation through Christ. And if they choose that, of course, that's great, and we can forgive them. But if they do not choose it, we know that they will receive the consequences. But again, we and God himself are not wishing that any should perish. And that should be our motivation for evangelism. All right, so again, the sources used in this presentation, as best I can recall, Reason for God by Keller, Systematic Theology by Wayne Grudem, Believing is Seeing by Guyan, I don't know how you pronounce it. A very, very interesting little book. Very popular level treatment of how science pushed him from agnosticism or even atheism to Christianity. All right, very, very easy to read, very quick read. Highly recommended. And of course, The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, a very short little book, very easy to read again, full of depth. So hopefully this has been helpful to you in trying to make sense of the concept of hell and seeing that in the end, perhaps there is no other reasonable alternative that does not make a mockery of perfect justice. So see you in the next video. And, hope you found this helpful.